Hello, my students. This is just going to be a short video explaining how I grade papers. Fun topic. I use this standard rubric for all the papers that I grade. This will go for any assignment that I've given you in class that is written in paper form. So I'm just going to walk through this, but you can use this to grade your own papers or to grade each other's papers as you practice. The general layout is that you have these categories from left to right, whether this quality is absent, ineffective, weak, good, or exceptional. The numbers across differ slightly per category based on how much I weight that category. Introduction and thesis gets 20% of your overall grade. Arguments gets the highest. I care most about logic and clarity. Truly, if you have good logic, good clarity of language, you are well over halfway there for my papers. So that's 30%, and then the clarity of language is 20%. Formalities, that's things like just following the assignment, having MLA structure, so very easy category to do well in, 20%, and then the conclusion, just 10% of your final overall grade. So the way it works is you print this out and then just circle the numbers all the way down, whether you're, terribly ineffective or only moderately ineffective, or whether you're good or exceptional. Circle the numbers you find most appropriate all the way down, and then add those up, and that'll give you your percentage grade. So the numbers in the exceptional category add up to 100. So these are the 5 categories that I grade based on. An introduction should be interesting and focused on the subject, but keep in mind that what is interesting for one audience may not be interesting for another. To start too broad is really uninteresting. This is an academic audience, and we care about things. So you can start a little closer into the subject. So if you're doing a poetry analysis and you say, poetry is a beautiful thing, your whole audience will sigh and go, yes, we know, don't tell us that. But if you tell us, John Donne was a dean at Christ Church Cathedral, and he wrote these holy sonnets that tell us a great deal about his inner spiritual life. Well, that's quite a bit more interesting. It is still broader than you're going to be in your paper, but it's a little closer to the subject, so that's better. So an introduction should subtly indicate and describe the audience. If you start your paper with a definition of poetry, that tells me that your audience is very young, very broad, and knows nothing about poetry, right? So your audience should always be, for these academic papers, an academic audience, so people who want to know things, of peers, so people who know about the same amount that you do. So they know that poetry is beautiful and good, hopefully, but they may not remember who John Donne is. They may have read this poem, but it may have been a while ago. All right, so you need to remind them. And it's also a good idea to write to a slightly skeptical audience. So an audience that has to be persuaded of the main thing that you're arguing. That generally makes for better writing, because it will make you think about what kinds of things do they need proven to them so that you can then prove them. All right. The thesis should address the audience's concerns with a focused claim that can be proved in the pages provided. So that means that it can't be too broad a claim. You can't, for instance, say John Donne was absolutely the best poet that ever lived and breathed, because that would take a lot more space than 3 pages to prove. It needs to address the audience's concerns. So in this case, the audience's concerns would be, what is this poem about? I'm not sure what this poem is about. So address that concern. In other cases, in other papers, the concern may be different. So if you're writing a paper about climate change to an audience that is skeptical of the importance of climate change, then those concerns will be something more specific, like I do not believe I have the ability to change the climate. Okay, so you want a thesis that addresses that concern. All right. A good thesis also has a map of the paper. So you want to say something like, well, here, I'll give you this. I probably have given you this already at some point, but just so you have it. This is a good thesis statement formula. Although X, Y is also true because A, B, and C. So although many people argue that climate change is not important, it is actually true that the individual can make a large difference in climate change because, and here are the reasons that I'm going to give in the paper. So the A, B, and C, they become the map for the paper. In a literature context, this might be something more like, although this poem is frequently taken as John Donne's fear of death, in fact, it is a prayer to relieve the fear of death. And we can see this by working through the stanzas that build the fear, the stanzas that explain why the division that he's afraid of, and then the stanza that he hopes will unite him and send him to heaven. Yeah, that was very big, but you would write that and then you boil it down. So these thesis statements often come out very large at first, and then you cut and boil and clean until they're these beautiful little pithy gems of wisdom. All right, the thesis is like the seed of the whole paper. You plant it in your paper, and from that, all your ideas can grow. So you do spend the most time on this thesis statement, and it is the single most important sentence in the whole paper. It should be at the end of the introduction, and it should set us up for the paper as we go through it. All right, the argument should be free of logical errors. It should follow the map of the thesis, so this is also an organizational thing. And it should persuade a skeptical audience that your claim is accurate. So you don't have to persuade an antagonistic audience, but you also don't want to just persuade people who already agree with you. All right, you want to be able to move your audience, even if just a little bit closer to your position. In terms of literature, your argument also needs to be very, very rooted in the text and to have good support when needed from the Oxford English Dictionary, from extra sources, definitely rooted in the text. Remember that what is on the page is the only thing that we really don't often or much dispute. So if you can say, look, there it is in the text, this is what happens, this is how I'm reading it, and if you can convince us that your reading is legitimate, you will have done your task. You can make the wildest claims, as long as you give us proof in the text that it might be plausible. Okay, so in terms of literature, you're pushing towards plausibility, towards showing that your reading is an accurate one. I would just caution you here, bit of advice. It seems not healthy for a person, or in the end, useful to their argument, to argue a thing that you do not actually believe. So choose an idea that you actually do in your heart believe to be true, and work through that idea and show why it's true. Convince somebody else, convince your reader that that reading is accurate or that that thing is true. If you do that, you will make better use of your time spent writing. You will understand your own ideas better. You might change your ideas, that's okay. You might just get a little bit more complex with them. But you will always be able to articulate them better after you write the paper, if you write what you really, really do believe. Okay, enough about argument, clarity of language. This really does start basically with being free of grammar errors. if you have a ton of grammar errors that are really impeding meaning, things like fragments, comma slices, pronoun reference problems, mismatched sentences, those sorts of things, they can make it really hard to follow a paper. This really bad clarity of language is going to take down the grade on the rest of your categories as well, just because I may not know if it has a good argument or not, because I don't understand what you're saying, right? So you want to be sure that you are at least free of grammar errors. Simply being free of grammar errors will take you up to a 16, maybe 17. Won't take you very high. What you really, really want is specific, concrete language. So instead of saying, it was a very windy day, it happens to be a very windy day, it just knocked something over on my back porch, I believe. So instead of saying, it was a windy day, you can say, the winds blew the pot off the rack on the back porch, all right? Or it was a day that shook the leaves. Just giving us, I mean, quite literally, more concrete. Winds is a thing that you can't see. Give me a thing I can see. I can see a leaf, right? So the more you think that way of replacing the big general words with more specific, concrete, like actual physical things, the more vivid your paper will be, the easier it will be to understand your ideas, and interestingly, the more you'll be able to explore your ideas as well, and come to more interesting conclusions. So yeah. Syntax, so the patterns of your sentences should be easy to read and clear. So it's the principle that easy reading is hard writing. So if it seems easy to me to read, then I will know that you have put in a lot of good hard effort on the writing side of things, and I will appreciate that. Any reader will. If your sentence structures is something that I don't usually notice just because your meaning is coming out, that is good, all right? I do not like ridiculously long, complex, flowery, verbose language when it is not necessary. I want the most appropriate word, apt, the apt word. Now, sometimes that is the flowery, complex word, but you better be sure that that flowery word is actually the only word that expresses what you're after. So for instance, there's a difference between pride and hubris, right? But if you use hubris, the $10 word, when all you really mean is, oh, he was a bit cocky. Don't use the word cocky, don't use hubris. Hubris is when you aspire to huge things and you fail in glorious triumph, all right? It has all kinds of connotations from the Romantic era. It means things. Cocky has a very different flavor, all right? So choose the word that has the flavor that is correct for your use. Okay. Formalities, very simple. Do the assignment. If you don't do the assignment or don't have an academic tone or don't use MLA formatting, you lose points off of this category gradually. If you complete assignments, if you have an academic tone, if you have cited everything and you have your works cited page and it's all in order, that's an easy A in this category. So that's all that's to be said about formalities. The conclusion, the best way to think about a conclusion is if you have done the work that you were supposed to do in your paper, then by the time we get to your conclusion, we will be kind of nodding and agreeing with you. All right, so you don't have to say it all over again. You'll just bore us. What we need to know at that point is, okay, all right, so this is how we are to take this poem. I can actually make a change in climate control. Okay, I agree. Okay, what do I do now? All right, so that's what your audience is going to be asking is, okay, I agree. What happens next? So you want to answer that question. So you do that by pushing into implications. All right, so for instance, if this poem really is about John Donne's crying out in a prayer that will draw his his soul and his body and his sins together and take him to heaven, then what we have in the end of that poem is a shattering and a putting back together. And as the reader walks through that poem with John Donne, there is a way in which his language and his reader's self becomes shattered. So this is sort of the big part of this poem, is that there's this hope in the end that as we imitated him in the falling apart and in the terror, so we might also imitate him in the reuniting and in the leaving of the world and the flesh and the devil. And we might come back to that beginning of the poem, which is, "This is my play's last scene," and that this there is a little bit ambiguous. It could refer to his place in life, or it could refer to the poem. So is this poem his play's last scene? Is this the last thing he will ever say to us, right? So this is my play's last scene. This is his life's last words to us. So we can take that poem and put it back in the larger context. And as I do that, as I explained all of that, you notice that I did actually review a lot of the points that I discussed in the poem, but I kind of put it together in this one little takeaway. Your reader's only going to take away one thing from your paper. What is the one thing you want them to remember? What do you want them to know as they leave? So ideally, it would bookend the paper. So I began my little sample paper with talking about the this and the problem of that very first pronoun in the poem. And I can end my paper by returning to that introduction. And it should move my audience, even if it's a literary analysis. This is a little easier to do in papers on topics like climate change, but it should move my audience to a change in opinion or action, or change in how they see the world. Certainly a change in how they see that poem. They should be kind of nodding and going, "Oh, the world looks a little bit different now because of what you just said." All right, and that's the place where you can really push into that. So that's what a good conclusion does. I hope that helps with all the parts of your paper. I hope that helps to clarify. This at the bottom is just a checklist for what you might want to think about at the different stages of the writing process. I will probably a little bit later be posting a video on the writing process so that you can use it for your final research paper and start planning that. Anyway, I hope that this helps, and do let me know if you have questions. I look forward to seeing you all.